Hi folks, I'm going to call the Standing Committee on Government Operations meeting to order. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? Moved by Ms. Reid, thank you. Declarations of conflict of interest, seeing none. Can I get a motion to move in camera, please? Or wait, no, we're public? Okay. Okay, public matters. Okay, public matters. We have a public briefing today on the proposed amendments to the Indigenous Employment Policy with the Honourable Carolyn Wozniak, Minister of Finance. Thank you for joining us, Minister Wozniak. Today's meeting is public and being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. Before we begin, I would just like to remind everyone to direct all comments and questions to me as Chair. I will now ask members to introduce themselves, starting with the members present in the room. Ms. Reid, would you like to start?
Good afternoon. My name is Kate Reid. I'm the MLA for Great Slave.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Hawkins. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife Centre, and happy to be here, and as well as appreciate this public briefing for millions of subscribers on the NWT Legislative Assembly social media.
Thank you, and my name is Julian Morse. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and chair of this committee. Yeah, we have limited time for this briefing, so Minister, I'll ask that you be quick with your presentation, but I will turn it over to you, and then we will try and get as many comments and questions in from committee members as possible. So I'll turn it over to you, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, while we bring up the presentation, I'm going to just introduce folks I have with me here. On my right, Bill McKay is the Deputy Minister of Finance. On my left, Tisha Heron is the Manager for Diversity and Inclusion. Also, we have Senior Advisor to the Deputy Minister of Finance, Nora Russell, in the room, and Drew Robertson, Senior Advisor in my office, in the room. So I am going to whip through this fairly quickly. I'll start straight into slide number 3, please. I'm going to try and do it in 10 minutes, Mr. Chair. We'll see how successful I can be. I wanted to start on this slide. Oh, 5 minutes, Mr. Chair. I'm going to try and make 5 minutes. First slide that I'm just calling attention to is just describing some of the engagement and what we heard that was done. It was formally done over 2022, 2023, but there's, of course, often discussion on the floor of this House at bilaterals that I attend with respect to public service hiring, the presence of Indigenous people within the public service. So this is detailing the formal process, but there's also been significant informal processes, which frankly have continued as we've seen throughout our own collective here in the last several months. When we released this back as a draft in December of 2024, obviously quite a lot of response came at that time, notwithstanding the previous engagement. So again, it's an ongoing dialogue, but and just wanted to acknowledge that there's been a lot of information shared and received. I'll go to the next slide, please. We'll try and go to the next slide. When we get to it, the next slide is about the Indigenous Employment Policy and where we've landed on this. So, and really what we're doing is the focus is to go to looking at Indigenous people and to, a few other small changes in getting away from language of Aboriginal persons and focusing on the use of Indigenous persons, which better aligns with preferred language. And really just making sure that we are now aligning all guidelines to prioritize Indigenous candidates and have a clearer reporting process within government. But I'll move to the next slide, hopefully. This is, or back one. So the tiered priority system, this is now where we are proposing to go forward on April 1st. It is what we were really looking at back when we did the formal engagements. This was more aligned with that, where there's the first tier is that first priority goes to individuals who are recognized members or descendants and descendants of the First Nations, Métis, or Inuit people Indigenous to the present boundaries of the Northwest Territories. And second priority goes to individuals who are similarly members or descendants of First Nations, Métis, or Inuit peoples, but maybe from groups outside of the present boundaries. And I do want to just make clear that I think this is where some folks have been saying that there's been prioritization of Southern Indigenous people. That one of the areas that I heard a lot during engagement from were that there are individuals living in the Northwest Territories who are Indigenous, but who may not be members of groups who are within the present boundaries. So, for example, folks from Smith's Landing might live in Fort Smith. Folks from more Gwich'in may live in the Gwich'in settlement region of the Northwest Territories, but may actually be a member from a group from the Yukon, Nunavummiut, so on and so forth. So this is to try to ensure that we are capturing the fact that we want to prioritize Indigenous peoples broadly and include anyone that may be found within the Northwest Territories and who is Indigenous, but recognizing that certainly treaty obligations and nation-to-nation relationships suggest that the tiered approach is appropriate. And this is, as I said, seemingly what is supported by Indigenous governments here. It's similar to how the Yukon does it, and they seem to be able to move it and to implement it. And on that note, next slide's on the implementation. I won't spend a lot of time here. One other thing I'll just note is it is meant to be applying to all processes, so including hiring, but also career advancement. And I would note the affirmative action policy actually also did apply to everything. I think perhaps over the years people may have not realized that that was the case, but it did as well actually apply to the entire process of hiring, career advancement, transfers, and so on. Go to the next. So this is an area I do want to highlight, and then I'm just about done, Mr. Chair. But support for local hiring. And this is something, these are tools that aren't new, but certainly haven't been employed perhaps to their fullest. And this is really an opportunity with the clarity and the focus to hopefully do that. And particularly having come out now and being fairly public in having these tools, we want to be using, for example, having local knowledge as part of our job descriptions, as being part of what we look for when we are screening people to participate in hiring, making that one of the criteria that people are, screened in for, that it's it can be part of the assignments or the interviews of what people's understanding of local knowledge is. Using also geographically limited competitions. So in other words, sort of saying that someone has to be a resident within a certain radius of a particular community. And also just noting here too, that of course, ordinary residents of the Northwest Territories still are prioritized for summer student and internship programs, which are a pretty significant pathway by which the public service does bring in new students, and particularly students who are returning from post-secondary programs, that this is a significant way to bring them into the public service. I think, Mr. Chair, with my last minute or so left, there are in this presentation, and I hope people will, take time to look at it with a bit more time, and I'm certainly happy to speak to anyone that's interested. But there's some pretty interesting information that just seeks to understand better, what is the challenge that we are facing, and how can we, move forward on it. We find that, so the GNWT, as people may know, is now an employer of about a quarter of the entire labor force in the territory. And labor force is not the same as total population, of course. So majority of our labor force in the Northwest Territories is non-Indigenous. So even though the population may be approximately 50-50, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, the labor force is not. Labor force is significantly more non-Indigenous. It's also significantly based in Yellowknife. And Yellowknife, of course, is one of the communities that is not majority Indigenous. So there's some challenges that we face just in the demographics of where people reside, who they are, and at the same time trying to be a public service that represents the whole of the territory. So, and I don't have a solution for it. I'm just pointing out that I think we need to understand, certainly we at the Department of Finance and HR want to understand, and as we create targets for departments and targets for different types of positions, understanding where the people are that we're drawing our labor force from will hopefully help us to align training and align programs. And on that, Mr. Chair, I think that's similar, and then this next slide makes basically that same point, that who the labor force is, where they are located, and just looking over time at the challenges that we've faced over time. The numbers are not new. It's not a new challenge that we're looking at, but we're hopefully looking at it with maybe a different lens and maybe with some different tools now. And on that, I'll actually, I think, go to the last slide, which is the Indigenous Recruitment Retention Framework as being a tool that we didn't have 5 years ago. It really is meant to, a fair bit of work went into understanding barriers that Indigenous people saw in being hired into this public service or being moved to more senior levels in the public service. There's a number of action items in there, and it really is meant to sort of understand the challenges that we have and provide, as I say, some fairly concrete responses to it. It also includes, as part of it, departments' Indigenous employment plans, which again, if we understand the demographics that we're looking at, we can better align targets and then report on them publicly, which we've begun to do, and have plans where departments can identify, are there areas where they know that they are lacking in Indigenous employees, and start to understand what the demographics are of those communities that they may be lacking those employees in, or if there's particular, again, if it's categories of training, that if they have a large proportion of requiring public or of post-secondary degrees, and there are less Indigenous people with post-secondary degrees, what can we do to support their entry into the public service, whether it's re-examining the entry qualifications and whether or not post-secondary is in fact a requirement, are there equivalents we can look at, or are there ways we can support training and post-secondary access so that we can continue to represent the whole of the Northwest Territories with the public service. Mr. Chair, there we are.
Thank you very much, and apologies for having to rush you through the presentation, but we got limited time today. And to that note, I would just ask the committee members, I think for this to be as fair as possible, I'm going to limit folks to one question for the first round. Hopefully we're going to be able to get to a second round. I would just ask members to try and limit preambles as much as possible, stick to questions, so we can try and have a fulsome discussion here in a very short period of time. Ms. Reed indicated she had a question first. Mr. Hawkins is next, and please let me know if you have questions, committee. Ms. Reed, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I spent a lot of time last night reviewing the feedback that this committee has received, and I crafted my comments to try and be short and to the point, so let me just get to that. Okay. So if we keep what we have always had, we're going to keep getting what we've always got. My colleague from Malfui is relentless, and with good reason, when she speaks about education for youth. Improving our educational outcomes is how you change the workforce in the long term. It's crucial that we don't forget this in this conversation. So systemic changes to education access and outcomes can easily become generational and doesn't allow the GNWT to aim for better Indigenous representation in the near term. So if my Indigenous colleagues are comfortable with this amended IEP for moving forward, I support them. However, what I do want to state unequivocally is that diversity, equity, and inclusion, or affirmative action, or whatever we want to call it, is fundamentally about prioritizing equity for underrepresented communities within the employer, especially underrepresented communities that have historical barriers to access employment. That is what getting to the question, Mr. Chair. So this is what AA tried to accomplish and IIP is seeking to address. What I'm most concerned about and what I hear from my constituents is a lack of employment equity policy going ahead at this time. So preferential hiring for folks with disabilities goes away on April 1. I really wish that the original scope of the employment equity policy was going ahead as well. So I would like to know from the minister what plans she has to further this crucial equity lens on government hiring, and the diversity and inclusion framework doesn't speak to hiring. So I'd like to hear what she has to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'll turn it over in a moment to Tisha Heron on this. She is the Manager of Diversity and Inclusion. I've said it before, and I do want to make sure that I address it myself as well, that I was honestly a bit surprised when we got responses back suggesting that this was not, that hiring targets were not necessarily what people wanted, or, that by requiring people to have to self-disclose whatever their status or an identity feature that they may have or hold was something that people were not uniformly in support of. And that there was better ways to do that, that they were not necessarily tying a particular identity feature of themselves, whatever it might be, as being one that aligned to their ability to deliver a position or ability to compete in a position. And I just say, last but not least, that the duty to accommodate people if they have a disability, for example, exists from the moment of hiring. I don't know that that's as well known as it should be. And we want to be in a position where people aren't having to positively or proactively disclose, but that where accommodations can be available proactively by the department and by hiring. But I do, again, we have the manager here, so I'd like her to have a few moments, please.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate this question. Much of what the Minister said were many reasons as to why we didn't go forward with employment equity policy at the time of engagement and then recommendation. It's not to say that we're not researching best practices into how to implement an employment equity policy. We don't want to be taking steps forward without knowing that we are taking the right steps, and especially around safety of the employees that will be disclosing their equity attributes. And so at this time, we are still doing more research and jurisdictional scans, and we want to know what the best practice is to move forward with that. And we will still continue to address gaps that taking away the affirmative action policy has kind of showcased, but we are actively working towards all of that at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, question.
Thank you for that. Although the Minister did flip through the presentation pretty quickly, I'll grant her that. But one of the areas that didn't, enough time wasn't spent on was the educational challenge and maybe the shortfall of why we're actually here. And the fact that there were several, I'm not sure if I'm permitted per se to highlight her speaking words, but I would just say that there's an enormous disparity between those who are employed without a high school diploma, who are Indigenous, versus those who have high school or better. It shows overwhelming employment opportunities. I guess the short question really is that, the point I'm trying to make is education is the key, not further re-engineering the policy. So, but Mr. Chairman, with respect to the policy, my question is this. I had conversations with Indigenous leaders and IGs, and they were concerned that the October 2022, if I remember correctly, and the December 2022 follow-up seemed to lack the premise of the actual implementation of what the IEP would look like. In other words, they were told, hey, we're going to work on improving Indigenous employment. I don't know any Indigenous government would be against that. And as a matter of fact, so the record's clear, I support increased Indigenous employment, so it's not lost on anyone or characterized in any other framework. That said, several have expressed concerns about dropping the priority 2 issue, the essence of women or persons with disabilities and other types of minority groups that are found in this situation to be lost in these sweeping changes by this. What consultation specifically was done with these Indigenous governments to highlight those areas of gaps that I've noted? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So back in October of 2022, there was initial letters sent out to Indigenous governments offering presentations by finance and describing the proposed policy changes. Back in December of 2022, there was then an overview provided to the Council of Leaders Secretariat of the proposed changes to the affirmative action policy, an invitation to, whether they wanted to do follow-up sessions or provide written feedback was made available to all of the representatives at the Council of Leaders Secretariat. In January, letters sent to Indigenous governments outlining again some of the different sessions being held and different forums and opportunities for feedback. We went also to mayors and council at the same time, detailing some of these changes. There was 14 in-person sessions held, 9 different communities, 3 in-person, 3 virtual sessions were held. We had a variety of attendees at those sessions, including representatives from different governments. There was, of course, the public survey method used as well, where we had over 560 different sources of feedback. We did a town hall for our own staff, and there was, Tisha may be able to speak to the process they went through. Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure how else to answer the question, Mr. Chair. So, I've also, obviously, Mr. Chair, had, over the course of several years, have opportunity to hear directly from Indigenous governments at bilateral meetings, at Council of Leaders meetings, at at IGCS meetings, and the need to hire more Indigenous people comes up over and over and over again. period.
Mr. Hawkins, do you want to very, very quickly just clarify your point?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the minister being able to talk about every meeting she's ever had, but that wasn't the question. It was about the gaps that would be the changes of the sweeping program. And frankly, that was the issue that they say that they've not been consulted on or never were consulted on. And all of a sudden, in December 2024, the policy dropped without those details of what they would be getting. So, thank you.
Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, if we're going to talk about the changes on the diversity element, I perhaps suggest that maybe Ms. Herron could speak to that.
Thank you. So we do recognize that there have been gaps created by taking away the affirmative action policy. And what is being done to prioritize local hiring, resident disabled, and resident women has been highlighted to us. So as a GNWT, we value that long-term Northerners and their unique skills and knowledge. Efforts to prioritize local hiring was mentioned briefly in the presentation, but highlighting the importance of local knowledge in job descriptions and staffing processes, using geographically limited competitions where appropriate, promoting careers with the GNWT through programs like the summer student internship programs, and the diversity inclusion framework, which was developed to address the needs of groups previously overlooked under the affirmative action policy. So through the diversity and inclusion framework, we have done multiple engagements in that area as well, and we are currently implementing that framework to address many of the gaps that have been showcased through engagement since the implementing the Indigenous Employment Policy for April 1st.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think the whole premise of these kind of policies, or no, the whole premise of these policies, whether it's affirmative action or whether it's BIP, is to put Northerners first in an unfair playing field, often with respect to education, to professional credentials, to backgrounds like that. The complaint that is frequently levied at people trying to decolonize hiring practices is over-credentialization of positions, not necessarily affirmative action policies. This is a huge issue in my riding. It is something I've heard again and again. It is something the committee has received feedback from, and very few people are supportive of this, and they're even less supportive of how it came out. We've identified there's gaps with those who are being left behind by the policy changing, but no plan to fix them. We had to do the minister had to do a last-minute change to incorporate the feedback from Indigenous folks and their governments. Summer students are somehow still prioritized the same way that they were before, even though there's a huge constitutional issue that has never been challenged in courts. Why are we making decisions that are consistently eroding the benefits Northerners have come to enjoy and rely on in this territory? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we are now continuing to prioritize Indigenous residents. 50% of this territory is Indigenous. They may not all be members of the groups who are members or who are represented within the current boundaries. But there are, many that are Indigenous Canadians, whether members of the local groups or local Northwest Territories-based governments or not. With respect to benefits, Mr. Chair, we are the ability or the opportunity to compete on a public sector job by the GNWT, so not a public sector writ large. You can still, obviously I can't control how the federal government might do their hiring, municipal governments might do their hiring, Indigenous governments might do their hiring. It's just the GNWT. The GNWT does still, at this point, have significant vacancies. We have a significant representation of non-Indigenous people within the public service, and a labor market situation where there's extremely high employment and low unemployment, particularly among non-Indigenous Northerners. And what we are finding out, however, is that there is a gap with Indigenous Northerners who do not enjoy the same level of employment. So there's no benefit being eroded. We are changing the priority by which we hire for the public service, recognizing the gaps that have been around for a significant amount of time, and trying to take a step towards fundamentally altering that so that there's actually filling the gaps in employment that we do see with those who are currently underserved by the availability of those positions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, for me, this is about increasing Indigenous employment in the territorial government. We've had the affirmative action policy now for 30-odd years. The stats say it really hasn't been working. I get that the attempt here is to try something different, to increase the number of Indigenous employees we have within the GNWT. We know, we've heard the stories, there's gaps there. There's gaps where you have, particularly, and I've heard, I talk to people in my riding of Indigenous employees who are in management positions that, may not have the necessary, I guess, post-secondary, but certainly have equivalencies that often are not considered to be able to move them beyond kind of where they are currently in their position. That's either done through not being screened in or through direct appointment. So I guess my question would be, now in this new policy, are we going to now put that same lens on direct appointments and equivalencies in order to increase Indigenous employment within the GNWT? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This, Mr. Chair, is where the Indigenous Employment Policy is really but one of a much larger suite of things we are trying to see and that have been coming out over the last few years, including the Indigenous Recruitment and Retention Framework. And one of the action items does relate very specifically to equivalencies. And I would suggest maybe Ms. Heron could speak to that in a little more detail, please.
Yes, through the Indigenous Recruitment Retention Framework, we have, throughout engagement, we heard that many, many times. Equivalencies are a practice that HR currently does already do. However, we've also looked at reducing the barriers to what does an equivalency look like in department land per se, and having those conversations that what biases are being perpetuated from, say, hiring managers who are creating the equivalencies in job descriptions, job competitions. And so we are having those conversations, especially with our human resource officers who are guiding the process to look at what is an equivalency look like that doesn't necessarily have to require a degree, but what types of lived experiences can value that position and be valued just as much as, say, a university degree.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Rogers, I'll get you on round two. I've just been limiting everyone else to one question. Ms. Whalen Armstrong.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I know that a lot of Indigenous people are probably pleased with the change made to the Indigenous Employment Policy, giving the first priority to the Indigenous people living in the North or Indigenous people of the Northwest Territories, and connecting to the groups identified, to the main group of the Indigenous people living in the North. So, which is good, and I know that, and I'm glad that that Minister identified we are at disadvantage in the GNWT workforce. Our number is low, we know that. And a lot of jobs are situated in Yellowknife, and in small community, we don't have many of the jobs. So I just want to ask the Minister if there's any plan in the future to move some of the jobs to the small communities to increase and improve the employment representation for Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, there's not a government policy per se to say that we're going to decentralize. The pendulum seems to kind of go a little bit sometimes between centralizing, decentralizing, back and forth, and it doesn't ever quite land on one or the other. What I would say, one of the visions that certainly I know I had when we introduced the remote work policy for the Northwest Territories was that it was meant to be a tool whereby someone, I mean, and Betchico is really a prime example because it's not that far away from Yellowknife. And that someone could reside in Betchico, for example, or Tuktoyaktuk, for example, have road access that's, you know, to a regional center and do the position that would be otherwise based in a headquarters position or in a regional headquarters position from a home community that was not in, you know, a larger center. So that hasn't come to as much fruition as I had hoped, to be quite frank about it. We are currently out publicly on a review of the remote work policy. I know we've actually had a lot of feedback, which I find very heartening. I think that's good that people are paying attention to it. But that is one tool that we were looking at for sure, is about trying to find pathways. But then beyond that is, again, back to the equivalencies issue. What jobs are there in the communities, and do we have the right level of equivalency? And or are we able to use tools like the geographic hiring model so that we're really, really trying to bring people who may be available to work in the positions to actually pay attention that maybe they want to move home to their home community because they see that there's a position for them there that they might not have realized. So a lot of this is the tools we use in hiring and not necessarily, you know, whether this policy or not, but the other tools that we have available to us, all part of, again, a bigger suite of things that we've been trying to do over the last few years. Anything else? Good.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, committee, for keeping your questions short, and Minister for keeping the answers short. It's given us the opportunity to do a second round. Mr. Rogers, I have you up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not so much I guess it is a question, but kind of a follow-up. I mean, we create policies to break down systemic barriers, and that's the issue here, is that, again, as I mentioned, about people being not given the opportunity, I guess, to be promoted or to move forward, and you know, based on equivalencies. So I guess what I'd look for is a commitment from the department to come back to say, listen, this is what we've done to ensure that our Human Resources Department are indeed following those policies to the nth degree and ensuring that equivalencies are being looked at, Mr. Chair, and that, you know, the policies, as we say, are only good if we're implementing them appropriately. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Over to the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I couldn't agree more. Obviously, you know, we service 33 communities and 5 different regions over a huge geographic territory, and ensuring that every member of the public service is aware of policies and policy changes and how they are meant to be employed is certainly a challenge. It's a challenge in every department, but it's particularly for this one. Again, couldn't agree more. So happy to make that commitment here, happy to come back. You know, I know, Mr. Chair, I've talked to you about ways that we can work with your committee and bring ourselves, you know, back here, whether it's to this type of format or some other, you know, process, so that people as MLAs are familiar immediately with these different tools we've been talking about, equivalencies and remote work policy and, you know, geographic hiring, whatever it might be, and we're monitoring all of that together, because the numbers are challenging. 50% of the labor force is not Indigenous. 50% of the labor force, 63% is non-Indigenous. So we're not. The numbers are not necessarily going to make this easier for us, but it doesn't take away the fact that we are representing a territory with 50% Indigenous people. What are the barriers to getting them into the public service, and how do we break them down? So, yeah, absolutely happy to commit to some form of collaborative opportunity. Again, whether it's simply coming back in this format, whether it's coming back again with diversity and inclusion, you know, Indigenous recruitment retention framework, however it works, we're happy to do that, and make sure that people are aware of it and the public's aware of it. Helps hold to account. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just by way of observation, I want to pick up on a couple last statements the Minister made before I proceed. You know, when I hear she wants to work with committee, she wants collaborative opportunities, that usually means what she wants and what she does, because this committee wrote, I believe, 2 letters. The other committee wrote another letter, or 3 letters, sorry, thank you. And the other committee wrote another letter saying don't proceed at this time. And yet, you know, when we hear we want to work collaboratively, it doesn't seem that way. Mr. Chairman, I won't go on too long, but it's an important point. I mean, there were problems with the affirmative action program that I think could have been fixed. By way of example, so people understand fully what I mean is, if I understand it correctly, a P2 born, so a non-Indigenous person born in the NWT, leaves most of their life and then comes back. That day they come back, they're treated as a priority too. And to me, that's disingenuous to the process of why the concept of what it did or was designed to do was to help support Northerners who have lived, and committed here. I don't think it was intended for people who were born here, then left, and then one day to show up and expect a priority planting. So to the specific question, Mr. Chairman, the issue really is the affirmative action program could have been strengthened and could have been clarified. So I'd specifically ask what recent reviews of the affirmative action program under the minister's tenureship, not lifetime of the policy, but under the minister's tenureship, that identified gaps and challenges such as education, credentials, interest levels of jobs, market availability, location, and reality, Mr. Chairman. There are a lot of things that could go on at length, but those are some of the problems people have said of getting employment, and including Indigenous people tell me they have problems and frustrations with the policy. So, in other words, what review and study of the gaps and challenges that have happened under this minister's time? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, I don't just sort of become aware of challenges the day that we become a minister. I've certainly heard of challenges with this before I even became a minister. And when I did come in, it was one of the first issues that was raised to me back in 2019 was around the existence of a policy that is known to not be working, known to not be delivering its purpose, which was a more representative workforce, and known to have elements of it that were unconstitutional. And I had immediately set about saying that we needed to fix that. So pushing 5.5 years later, here I am. We've done significant engagement in 22-23 based upon research that began likely before I became a minister, but continued through that point to prepare ourselves to have materials to go out and do engagements about. The Indigenous Recruitment Retention Framework was already in a draft stage when I began as a minister, but it rolled out during my time here. So again, it began, I guess, before 2019, but that doesn't mean that I don't take ownership of it. Specific to talking about education, tenure, that side of what human resources looks at, that is probably more properly within the Indigenous Recruitment Retention Framework and the Diversity and Inclusion Framework, which certainly, as I said, straddled both before I became in this role and my predecessors, but certainly have been rolling out, certainly under my watch, if you will put it that way. Mr. Chair, I would like to hope that we would not look only to a single minister of human resources as being the point in time that we want to address a problem of 35 years. It's a problem of 35 years. I'm, in some ways, going to say I'm fortunate to be the one that gets to sit and deliver an opportunity for change in the form of first the Indigenous Recruitment Retention Framework, which came out, the Public Service Strategic Plan, which has since come out, the Remote Work Policy, which has since come out, the Diversity and Inclusion Framework, which has since come out. All of these are things that have happened in the last 5 years. I'm proud of them, but getting them to work together is not a small challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Testrada, have you up next?
Yes, thank you. So, look, to be clear, this is a problem. This policy hasn't worked. It didn't work the last time I was an MLA. It wasn't working the last time I was an MLA, and it hasn't been working for 30 years. So it does need to change. The issue, I think, is how the policy objective, as I understand it, is now to create this kind of two-tier, which is one, to bring in Indigenous Northerners into the public service, and then the second is to bring Indigenous people generally into the public service. So if the goal is to create a representative public service of the makeup of the territory, how does bringing Indigenous people, regardless of where they're from, create that representation? Because we still haven't solved the problem that I think was addressed the first hand around, which is you'll have now, as per the policy, unless I don't understand it, you can have an Indigenous person from Ontario or from Nova Scotia or anywhere else applying on jobs here and getting priority status over a Northerner, not a Northern Indigenous person in the same competition, but over Northerners. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a couple responses. I'll try. I'm conscious that I'm not always very brief, and I apologize. So trying to move to a representation of Indigenous people in Canada, that was something that did come up in the course of the engagement that we went out on, that there are folks who now live in the Northwest Territories, may or may not be born here, but live here, who are Indigenous Canadians, and feel that the affirmative action policy did not reflect the fact that they were Indigenous Canadians now living as Northerners and wanting to contribute to the North. So again, first tier really, I hope, is relatively clear in its purpose, capturing individuals who have a connection to the groups of the North, but may or may not be born here. So again, you may have a Clecho citizen or Gwich'in or Nubialabit person who's born elsewhere and comes back, or who may even have lived a large part of their life away but wants to come back. But trying, again, the purpose is to focus on the group of individuals who are underrepresented, and that's Indigenous Canadians, and it includes those who are members of these groups, those who are born here, those who come from away and join here. I don't sense that there's a lineup at the border of people wanting to come north, but also, Mr. Chair, I've certainly heard it said to me that if there's an opportunity to bring a councillor who is a member of, an Indigenous group from a southern jurisdiction, they may well have a worldview that better aligns with that of a small community here, and therefore not be unwelcome to come and join and to bring that perspective to the North. We are certainly going to see how this unfolds. This is how the Yukon has theirs structured. Anecdotally, they're certainly not seeing some huge influx of Southern Indigenous persons to the Yukon. There are Indigenous hiring attempts all over Canada right now because a lot of the public service of other provinces and territories and federal government are realizing that this is a group that's underrepresented in our public service. So I'll stop there, Mr. Chair. I feel your time eyes on me.
Thank you, and appreciate everyone keeping their questions and comments brief, just so we can get as many people in as possible. Ms. Whalen Armstrong, I have you next.
Thank you. We are in the year 2025, and we are still talking about improving and increasing the Indigenous representation in GNWT, or improving the education, for our people is beyond comprehension, And I keep thinking and sitting here, thinking about the former South Africa apartheid legislations. And it just, in our people, there's more of us in the Northwest Territories. There's more of Indigenous people living in the Northwest Territories, and we are at disadvantage. It's just with the number that the minister showed to us, and 56% are non-Indigenous. I'm not too sure if you said 56%, but over 50% job held are by non-Indigenous and mostly situated in Yellowknife. And in small communities, it's not like that. We don't have too many of those jobs, So, but it is good that GNWT is trying to make an effort, focusing on the Northern Indigenous. It's a good thing. It's a good start. And I know that with the equivalencies, the only way that it can be achieved is by improving the education outcome for our students living in small communities. And the minister said that IEP summer students, it's not, doesn't apply. The IEP does not apply for the summer students. Well, this is where I said we're at disadvantage because not too many of our Indigenous are in post-secondary, or they go to post-secondary because of the poor education outcome. They don't meet the requirements to challenge or to take a program. So a lot of them, I know that they're not taking high-level courses. They taking other, like some are start going upgrading. And not too many jobs in small communities. That's another disadvantage, especially for GNWT. So, so that's why I was hoping that, that we were going to see some more jobs being transferred to small communities. Hopefully it will have different perspective for our youth. It will have they will have different perspective about career choices and maybe doing more like improving their education. Well, if the focus has changed to improving the education outcome, more of that starting from the elementary, I think we still have a chance. We still have a chance, and there is still hope for our young people to improve. I know right now there's a lot of work that's going to be done by our youth because of where they come from. Oops, sorry about that. It's so IEP is not. It's not does not apply to the summer students. So in the small community, so I just want to know if minister is if there's gonna be more GNWT jobs created in small communities. I know last year there was not too many, so I just want to know if with this policy in place to help our Indigenous students gain more. This is the only way they're going to gain, work experience, and maybe they can work towards, developing or going into that career field. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, so the affirmative action policy applied to students, this does apply to students. So students still, if they're in a small community, the Indigenous Employment Policy would apply to students. It's the idea, the difference is that you have to be ordinarily resident to gain access, to have extra access. So there's a bit of an advantage for students who are ordinarily resident to be summer students or to be interns. So as for, summer student positions or internship positions in communities, I, again, have noticed, and I don't have numbers, it's sort of anecdotal, we often don't get as many applicants in the small communities. I don't know the reasons for that. I don't know if there are things we can or should be doing better to go out and recruit. I'm certainly committed to look back to that, because the summer student program does depend on folks coming in, and then you will often match. If there's a student from a community, there can be a proactive outreach from the Department of Finance to say, for example, to infrastructure, if you have someone with, I'm trying to think of a good example, or maybe if someone's a student at Aurora College in nursing, they could get matched. If they go back to a home community, they could get matched in if there's a health center that maybe there's some work they could do there. So I'm just sort of giving a brainstorm of a response, but really it's getting those students in the small communities to apply. And I think the member's point is quite spot on. Students need to see themselves to know that this is even something they should be applying to. So I think there's probably work that we can do there to help encourage that. I'm happy to take that back and to report back to, again, to committee in whatever format it is interested, that getting those students to look at the GNWT as an opportunity is pretty critical. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that commitment to follow up from the minister. Ms. Reid, I have you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in response to my first question, I was very happy to hear that the department is doing work on possible employment equity work and possibly hiring work, and I'm getting a nod, so that's nice to know. My question then is, when can stakeholders to that work expect an opportunity to provide their expertise? I'm thinking of the Disabilities Council, I'm thinking of the Status of Women, Native Women's Association, and the like, as well as folks who are representing 2S LGBTQIA plus workers, such as Northern Mosaic Network, the broad spectrum of advocacy groups that would be able to provide crucial feedback on such a policy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
I'll send that to Ms. Herring, please.
Thank you. I can't give you a definite date of when we can say we will meet with the equity groups you've mentioned. However, in our engagements for the diversity and inclusion framework, we did have engagements with many groups across the territory, and we made the commitment to continue engaging throughout the implementation of the diversity and inclusion framework. The most couple years that we've our focus has really been on the Indigenous Recruitment Retention Framework. We are a small team of 5 people, and so now that much of the work in the Indigenous Recruitment Retention Framework is well on its way, we are definitely shifting gears and focusing on the Diversity and Inclusion Framework, which is actually a huge framework alone in itself of much of the work that needs to be done as well. So we definitely will be engaging further with groups. However, I just can't give you a definite date as to when that will happen. Most recently, we actually did bring the Diversity and Inclusion Framework implementation plan to the Government Advisory Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. And we have many representatives from many different groups within that advisory committee. And they were very excited to hear about the work that's to come and are very much willing to support us in the implementation of that. And so, yes, work is underway. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed, but it will be, we are moving forward with that, and there will be continuous engagement as it's an adaptive framework, much like the Indigenous Recruitment Retention Framework. It's built to look at the gaps that are currently in place, the gaps that may come, and what can we do actively to close those gaps.
Thank you. We have time for one extremely quick question left. Mr. Hawkins, I have you up first.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll try to be very succinct. The minister says known to be unconstitutional. So I'm stuck in this quagmire of confusion because I've never heard it actually being tested. I've never seen a legal opinion shared with this committee or any members in my time, and I go back to 2003. So I don't even know if a legal opinion actually exists. And we also have many policies and other positions that are of concern. Locally, and I'm referring to territorially, as there was some up here, Mr. Chairman, we could have, for example, the BIP has been known to have concerns, but we proceed forward with it because it's good for Northerners. The right to collective bargaining, a single unit, that question's been out there in the department. We know, yes, so, sorry, just thank you. Why are P2s okay, but P2 adults aren't okay? There's a question. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, Bill 21 in Quebec is known as unconstitutional and begging to be challenged. So why is this? Where is the unconstitutional legal opinion on this particular thing that we're so on unstable ground that we must make these changes that affect P2s, women, people with disabilities, and persons of minority classes? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, very quickly, please.
I'll try, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the labor mobility issues in Section 6 of the Charter do make it quite clear that by creating a barrier that's based upon residency, that makes it likely unconstitutional. Look, I'm not a judge, and so technically nothing is unconstitutional unless so declared by a judge, but there are certainly some laws or policies that are much more likely to be found unconstitutional than others, and it would be an opinion to say that this is likely falls within that category given the fairly clear provisions of Section 6 of the Charter and how they would apply here. But Mr. Chair, coming back, there's a much larger element of the question going back to what's been already asked, which fundamentally is why remove the P2s. And again, Mr. Chair, they are not an underrepresented group in the public service. They are not a disadvantaged group in the public service. They do not require. This is not a cohort of individuals who require special or affirmative action type treatment in order to gain employment. Quite the opposite. There's 1% unemployment in this group at a time when we have certainly open positions available to people who live in the Northwest Territories and who could benefit from, as we've been saying, these different tools we have available to us that we'd like to start to employ more around local knowledge, cultural knowledge, languages, geographic hiring, and so on and so forth. The group that is underrepresented and known to be unrepresented are Indigenous Canadians, and that is the focus of the policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, so I pushed it right to the wire. We are out of time. Thank you to committee members for all your questions. Thank you to the Minister for fielding them, and everybody trying to be as brief as possible so that we could give everybody a voice. Minister, if you have closing, very, very brief closing comments, I'll give you the floor, but otherwise we'll wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My brief closing comments are, and I know you and I have had a lot of discussions about this. I have asked that committee present a suggestion or a pathway by which staff from Human Resources can work with you, that I could work with you either directly or that this team can work with you, so that the implementation of not only this, but this as being one part of a much bigger system of improving the public service representation is one that is well understood and followed by committee. So I'm still open to that. I'll reiterate that request here as I've made it in letters to you. Whether that happens today or another day, really I do want to see that the public service becomes representative. I think that improves morale, it improves who we are, and I want to see it succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. So that concludes the public portion of our meeting. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Millions of subscribers, as Mr. Hawkins likes to put it. And thank you to the Minister and her staff for making time for committee today. Thanks.
Millions.